Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Today on Writers at Work, I'll be speaking with M.T. Anderson, an author of enormous imagination. His latest novel, Nicked, is his first for adult readers. It's set in 1087, and a gang of misfits is sailing to what's known today as Turkey to recover the 700-year-old bones of St. Nicholas. Yes, that's St. Nicholas. But Nicked is not a Christmas story. It is an amazement, aptly described as a swashbuckling saga, a meditation on the miraculous, and medieval noir. And it features a wonderful character, Brother Nicephorus, a gentle dreamer who in his innocence may be the wisest participant in this adventure. Matthew Tobin Anderson has had 3 of his novels shortlisted for the National Book Award in the Young Person's Literature category. His The Astonishing Life of Octavian Nothing, Traitor to the Nation, Volume 1, The POX Party, won that award. This year, his Elf Dog and Owlhead received a Newbery Honor. Time magazine called his 2002 novel Feed one of the 100 best YA books of all time. Feed portrays a dystopian society in which the citizenry is controlled by implants that permit, among other things, an endless barrage of messages from corporations. Through his novels and his picture books, he's also introduced young readers to classical musicians Frederick Handel, Eric Satie, and Dmitri Shostakovich. I'd love to tap into all that, but I want to begin with Nicked, a novel I just finished, and I'm still living in the afterglow. M.T. Anderson, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thanks for having me.
I understand Nicked is based on a true story. When did you first hear about it?
I heard about it several years ago. I was interested in the kind of historical life of the real St. Nicholas, like, not our Santa Claus with all of the accretions from the 19th century with the sleigh and the North Pole and the elves and all that. So I had been interested in how the original St. Nicholas had lived during the Roman period, and then also what he'd turned into in the Middle Ages. The stories, these very, very bizarre stories about him that have been forgotten now. Things like the fact that the reason we give presents in his name, for example, is because he overheard the father of 3 girls next door telling the girls, like, we've run out of money, sorry, I'm gonna have to sell you to a brothel. And so St. Nicholas put 3 bags of gold, one for each of the girls, and threw them through the window secretly at night, so that they would have dowries and would therefore be able to marry as they wished. So, like, there are these stories like that. He was fighting demons, he fought a serial killer, all these kind of crazy stories. So I was looking into those, and that is when I came across a kind of single paragraph that said his body had been stolen from its tomb because it supposedly drizzled this magical oil that if you drank it would heal you. And of course I was immediately like, whoa, slow down, what's that story? And so that's, it was a few years later that I kind of returned to that and started to do real research on the reality of this bizarre theft.
One of the things there's so many things I did love about the book, but one of the things I loved most is, it's named Nick, and you tap into the legend of St. Nicholas, but you really don't oversell it. You sort of parcel out this information, historical data about St. Nicholas, but it wasn't until the end of the research I was doing that I realized you could have written a lot more about him, but you trusted the reader enough to know that this was the essential information.
Yeah. And I mean, so actually I ended up finding several documents about the theft that had not been previously translated. So I had them actually translated by some sad graduate students. They're sad because they're classical scholars, they're Latinists, but even tougher for them, they're medieval Latinists. They just can't be a very good gig right now, you know what I mean? But anyway, they were incredibly kind in and I hired them to translate these things. And once they translated them, I discovered that there was a whole kind of part of the story that had not been told before. And in fact, I was part of the way into writing the book already, the novel, so I couldn't really use all that info. So
Ah,
I'm going to actually do a nonfiction book for teens, because my other audience has been younger readers. And so a nonfiction book for teens that will include a whole thing about like who was the actual Saint Nicholas? How did he get transformed bizarrely through the ages into this figure who like flies through the air and saves sailors by lifting them out of the water and all this kind of thing? So there's going to be that will then also tell the historically accurate story of the heist. So that, I mean, in fact, though, the outlines of the story I tell in the book are pretty close to the original, but I gave myself this time around like a Hollywood out, like use the facts, but use them as Hollywood would, meaning, change things if you need to make it trashier. You know what I mean? Like that was my goal. Take something sublime and ancient and make it trashy. That really was my goal.
well, as a writer, well, you pardon the expression, but you had the skeleton of the story.
Yeah,
But
well said.
at but at what point did you start to get really excited about this? And when did you start thinking how you could tell this story in your own distinctive way?
Well, I mean, I kind of knew immediately sort of who the characters would be. I knew there'd be this love story also between the relic hunter and the monk who hires him, that kind of thing. I kind of knew that that was going to be part of it. But I think, like, um, it's just to speak kind of biographically for a second about myself, but I think that this will speak to other writers. During the pandemic, after 6 months of wonderful productivity, because I had no place to go and no one to see and was living alone in a house with a dog, I hit a slump, like many of us. Suddenly, I think a lot of us started to feel our work was irrelevant, like so much about the way the human world had conducted itself was irrelevant. What were we going to do? And it took me about a year and a half, I think, to kind of recover from that slump after the initial burst of activity during the pandemic. And in this case, I decided to go to Turkey to actually see the ruined basilica of Saint Nicholas, where he had been a bishop in the 4th century, or actually the building that is built on top of that site, because his original church is gone. But so, and I think that it was going there to Turkey and seeing the incredible way that that countryside is a palimpsest of some of the most fascinating empires the earth has ever seen. The Greeks, the Romans, the Byzantine Empire, the Seljuk Turks, the Ottomans. It's just like, it's so incredible to feel that history so vivid there in this very quite stark landscape. I mean, I went in the middle of the summer and it was 100 degrees, 110 degrees, that kind of thing. um very different than the North Pole, by the way. So anyway, it was seeing that spot there where he had actually been buried, where his body had lain for 700 years untouched before these stooges came along and stole it. So that kind of was the thing that moved me from, this is an idea I'm trying to convince myself about, to here is the project that's going to absorb me for the next 2 years.
So, can we talk a little bit about Brother Nicephorus?
Sure.
At your urging and your afterward, I read his account of the adventure.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and you see something in him that's not exactly in his writing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So to clarify, just for the listeners, the main character of my book, Nicephorus, takes his name from a real chronicler who wrote an account of the theft, probably either weeks or at longest months after it happened. A guy who calls himself Nicephorus, the least of the clerks of Bari, the city of Bari in Italy.
Right.
And so yeah, I mean, I needed a central figure. I wanted a central figure who kind of is telling the story, that kind of thing. And so I chose him, and yes, I absolutely went beyond his personality in the account, though I have to say it is a very kind of like flowery account.
Mhm.
Flowery but weirdly honest, considering he's describing his own city like stealing something that they clearly are not supposed to have in some sense, right?
Yeah. No.
So, there's an honesty to it, but at the same time, a kind of a love of detail and a love of poetry that I thought was sort of like something that I could use.
Yeah.
Um, I did change. So, in my version, in the novel, it is a dream of his that actually prompts people to go
Right.
on this voyage. And there is a Russian account that says that there was an unnamed cleric of the city of Bari who had this dream, and that's what convinced people to go. But weirdly enough, in Nicephorus's account, that's not how it is. It's much more kind of a calculation by these guys on the ship. They're like, we're passing by this city, we might as well steal this corpse. So I decided to go with something where he would actually have a dream, and that was I oftentimes was choosing between versions of the story, and that
Yeah.
was a case where I didn't go with him.
Yeah. I found him to be so engaging. I mean, he's in the middle of all these duplicitous and dubious characters, and yet his superpower is that he's thoroughly honest.
Right, he can't lie. Yeah,
Right.
that's his
And,
problem. Yeah.
and I sensed that you liked him too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a part of me that is like that. I mean, it's kind of like moral but also kind of naive at the same time. And there's this sense that the I feel like the world right now it applauds a certain amount of ferocity, aggression, duplicitousness, like, because then you're getting what you're supposed to get, you're getting what you need for number one, you know what I mean?
Right.
And I feel like even from a kind of evolutionary point of view, that's a terrible way for humans to fundamentally understand themselves.
Right.
It's not going to work out well for us. And so I kind of wanted to explore, what does it mean to be this kind of innocent in the middle of everything, and what can you achieve through innocence that you can't achieve through duplicity and betrayal.
Right. I think the saint hunter is a 21st century guy in
Right.
some ways. And what I love about the book is, the language that you choose to use reminds us that it was 1,000 years ago, but the story is also very contemporary.
Yeah, and the language thing, I mean, because we're talking to writers, I want to talk just briefly about that, because it's so tough to decide what register of speech you're going to use for historical novel. I mean, because, if you read a translation, for one thing, you're usually translating documents that are written in a formal kind of prose, and then they are oftentimes like they're like Penguin Classics or whatever has tended in the past to turn them into something that sounds formal in the present day,
Right.
right? And
Yes.
and so as a result, when you read a lot of historical novels, doesn't matter what period they're set in, they all sound like they're spoken by like Katharine Hepburn in 1940. You know what I mean? Like, it's this kind of like quasi English kind of, but not really, sort of middle of the Atlantic kind of accent that is almost adopted, where everyone is sort of well spoken and formal, and it's all huzzah and that kind of crap. And I wanted to create a language that is as flexible as ours, where we speak in different registers. You and we talk differently when we're on this podcast than we do when we're talking to someone's kids or our mom or whatever.
Right.
And I wanted to create that sense of like, there are different ways for these people to speak. Sailors on a boat are not talking the same way the abbot of a monastery speaking to his congregation. Like, it's not all going to sound in that sort of slightly inflated way. And so, I mean, like, people seem, a couple of reviewers were shocked by the fact that there was swearing in the book. And I was like, don't you think that sailors in the 11th century swore? Don't you think that there was the Greek equivalent to fuck that they said sometimes, like, so I wanted to, and like, that's a very crass example, but I really wanted to create a thing where there are chunks of language as that feel very much of what we think of as the period, that I took from documents or from fun stories written about, like, especially like some of the Muslim tricksters of the period. They have recorded a lot of very, very fun stories of how they swindled people and stuff. So I wanted to kind of capture some of that language, but at the same time, do so in a framework that still allowed for things to sound informal at other times. Like, it's formal, it's informal, it's thieves speaking, it's monks speaking, and each person speaks differently, just as we all speak differently.
Yeah, I think you did it wonderfully well in the sense that, and I don't know how you think about this, but when I'm reading a book and I have to put it down briefly, and I can't wait to get back to it, a lot of that has to do with me wanting to be back in that world. Um, and I don't mean to minimize plot or story, but I just want to live in that world again.
That's
And
fantastic that you felt. Yeah, that's great. And I
and
agree. That's one of the things I love too, right? Yeah.
yeah, and you did that really well. And this concept of historical novels,
Yeah.
a novel written in 1969 today is a historical novel,
Right.
right?
Depressing but true.
Right. So I don't know what life was like in 1087, but I completely believe what the world you created for me, and I thank you for that.
Yeah, and I mean, but also, once again, speaking to kind of like a professional audience, I did have some back and forth with the editor about how much do I push period terms. And in some cases he was like, there's no reason to really use this one. Why don't you draw back a little bit here? And my editor was extremely useful in saying, like, this one's not worth it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, because on the other hand, like, on the one hand, I wanted to insist that, like, the the use of the older terms for types of ship, because, like, it's kind of weird that 1087 you're still dealing with, like, ships that are largely, like, warships that are rowed by hundreds of people.
Right.
It's not like, even, like, a decade later or more, where you start to see ships kind of more like what we think about with, sort of square rigged ships that are blown by, they're propelled by sails or whatever. You know what I mean? So it's this transitional period, and it's kind of interesting to insist upon the fact that you use the word for, like, like a bireme or whatever. You know what I mean? Even though that's not a word that we typically are using now. So that's one thing, but the editor did push back on certain other words for clothing items or whatever, and I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Let's just do it in a way that's unobtrusive to the audience rather than something that sticks out.
Yeah. So your early drafts, uh, are they longer than what you eventually published, or are you the kind of author that has to go back and fatten things up a bit?
Well, I mean, it differs incredibly from project to project, because I've tried different methods of writing. I mean, in some cases, I have literally written out a skeletal scene by scene breakdown of a whole book and then written it. And in others, I have started writing without knowing even what the ending is going to be.
Hmm.
And obviously, in the latter example, you end up having to cut a lot of stuff and reshape a lot. And whereas in the other, then there's sometimes, like in this one, there was actually, it was longer in the final version than when I first wrote it, because I knew exactly what had to happen, because I was basically following a lot, I mean, to a great extent, the real narratives, right? But at the same time, like, eventually I started to realize, okay, this is a little bit too lean. I need a little bit more here. So, and I would say, asking the question of, do you plot out a book entirely, or do you start from just, like, shoot something into space and see where it lands? My experience has been that more inward novels that are going to deal with more personality, character based arcs, that works better if you kind of just start without knowing where it's going, perhaps. Whereas if you're going to do a mystery novel, a suspense novel, something that has to have like a lot of exterior plot that has to be clamped into place, it really helps to have an outline of some kind before you begin, so you don't just dribble away trying to find the next cliffhanger.
Sure, because if you don't, you find on Friday that you have spent the entire week
Right.
writing yourself out of where you want to be.
Exactly right. And if you have to have like red herrings versus clues and you want to set stuff up, you want to, like one of the things that I think is watching modern series, like I think we all underwent a kind of collective lesson in the dangers of writing by the seat of your pants when we watched Lost back in the
Right.
aughts. And like they kept on telling us it's all going to make sense. We have a plan. Those bastards didn't have a plan. We got to the end of the series and it was totally incoherent. And their response at that point was, "Well, we couldn't explain everything that happened." And my reaction was, "That is literally your job. Your
Right.
job is to have things hang together conceptually so that they make sense." And
Yeah.
it's pretty disappointing when you have something with lots of cool like turns and involutions that then ends up just frizzling away to nothing because the person didn't make a plan ahead of time.
Right. I've become recently obsessed with the idea that a book needs to be as long as it needs to be.
Yes.
And I think it's 217 pages.
Yeah.
And I honestly didn't want any more, and I'm glad
Yep.
there was nothing less.
That's exactly how I felt, right? Like well, I mean, especially because nowadays, I feel like people are starting to enjoy shorter and shorter books. And I kind of feel like by and large, the emotional potency of writing, once you get to kind of a novella length, I feel like there's not a lot of difference in the emotional potency from length, going from say the novella to the 500-page novel. You know
Mm,
what I mean? Like I
sure.
don't get, um, just one takes a lot longer. So I don't
Yeah.
know. I
No.
used to write, yeah, I used to write much longer things than I do now.
Yeah. I think doorstops. I don't know. Uh, I. Yeah.
Of course, there's
That,
going to be room for them. Of course, there's going
right.
to be.
That's
And
right.
there are masters of them. But I'm just saying that I feel like as a cultural thing, there's some delight right now about stuff that's like 200 pages long that can really situate you in a world, just like you were saying earlier, Jim. But then also at the same time, um, like has enough architecture to it that you feel something throughout that without feeling like you have to go on for twice as long as you expected to.
Right. Did you think about Nick might be a subject for young readers, or was it always going to be the novel it turned out to be?
It was always going to be for adults. I didn't want to have to pull certain punches kind of just conceptually. I didn't want to have to deal with the question of, are teens going to be interested in this particular thing? You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that. Yeah, so it always was going to be a book for adults.
Yeah. Your first novel was published in 1997, right?
I know.
And then Burgerwurst came in 99.
Hmm.
You've published fairly consistently since then, meaning readers who were 14, when you started are in their 40s now.
I know.
Do you hear from readers who grew up with your work?
Absolutely, yeah. And at first I found it unsettling. I mean, the big book of mine that people tended to know or have tended to know is Feed, which is a kind of science fiction satire that came out in 2002. And I remember it was a shock to me starting around like what, 2014, 2015, that full adults, of course, were then um, people who I considered very much kind of like, in one sense, sort of almost peers, could definitely say like, "Oh, I read that as a teenager." You know what I mean? And I
Right.
have to admit that that was kind of a shock, kind of like the first time someone referred to me as a man, and I was like, "Holy crap, they're right. I'm not a boy anymore. I'm 23. I'm a man."
You know, What lessons do your readers tell you that they've taken from your books?
Well, it very much depends on the book. I
Yeah,
mean,
I
and
guess.
I think one of the amazing things about being an author is you never know what is going to speak to a particular reader. So a lot of people write to me about feed and they say, like it opened their eyes to the way that consumerism kind of like creates our sense of self and our sense of the world, which is fantastic. I love the fact that people get that out of that book. But I mean, to me, my favorite like odd angle that some people took was my book Landscape with Invisible Hand, another science fiction satire, has a main character who is undergoing he has a really bad stomach syndrome that's it's based on Crohn's disease.
Right.
And so this is, and it's part of that book is about like healthcare and that kind of thing, essentially. And so I got a letter from a bunch of kids at a camp for Crohn's disease, and they were like,
Oh,
finally someone actually takes this disease seriously, which is complicated because part of the disease is that like there's so much just flatulence, blah blah blah, all these things that
right.
are undignified. How interesting to talk about that, they were saying. So they thanked me. Here's my favorite thing: the camp motto is "shit happens."
That's great.
So I love those kids. I was like, thank God. Like, I never thought that that would be the audience responding. And yet, it was great that they found that for themselves in there.
Right. I'm so glad you mentioned landscape with invisible hand and also feed because I wanted to talk to you about AI, if you don't mind.
Oh, yeah,
Um, and let me say that I find it to be simultaneously fascinating and terrifying.
absolutely.
And what I think is we've been here before in fiction, but also in reality, where systems are designed to serve us,
Mm-hmm.
but eventually they alter our behavior in such a way that we are serving the system.
Amen.
And you get to that in both of those books, where your characters and the society at large that you've created are granted these alleged gifts,
Mm-hmm.
which alter what I would consider to be our humanity,
Mm-hmm.
which is, I think, what's going to happen with AI.
I agree.
Did
Yeah.
you? Yeah. Did you see the comment by Harper Collins's CEO Brian Murray at a recent UBS Global Media Conference?
No, what did he say?
Okay, I'm going to read it from PW.
Okay.
He said the fast evolving AI sector could deliver new types of formats for books. HarperCollins is experimenting with a number of potential products. One idea is a talking book, where a book sits atop a large language model, allowing readers to converse with an AI facsimile of its author. An AI facsimile
Yeah.
of its
Right.
know.
Yeah.
That 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 doesn't end well, does it?
No, I mean, it would feel very violating because God knows. I mean, like the interesting thing about AI is that it kind of, any given example of it, like that one, there's a danger to it, whether it is accurate or whether it is making one of its characteristic mistakes. Both directions have all kinds of ways that that could go wrong. You know what I mean?
Right.
And Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. A book festival that shall remain nameless. When was it? Last year, last fall, already had a statement that I had to, like, in its contract, that I had to ask my agent to have amended, where they said, your presentation at this book festival, you are signing away the right for us to use the kind of the audio and the images in any way we want, including manipulation by AI, kind of like and then there was a whole list of freedoms that they would enjoy around the manipulation of that, so that literally, as I pointed out to them, I can't sign this because I'm reading a book for 10-year-olds, and by rights, you have actually allowed yourself, if you wanted to create a video of me reading that book and adding pornographic elements, just to
Yes.
use one example, right?
Yes.
Like
Yes.
that's actually covered. They're like, we're allowed to change the story, we're allowed to change the image based on AI capabilities. And I was just like, I'm not comfortable with that. Sure, you can use my image in a video or a brochure, but you can't decide what I say. And I think that there are that's just the corner of the difficulties that AI are going to present, not just to writers, but to all employed humans.
Right. Right. I think that we as writers, yes, of course, we have fascination with the technical uh, achievements of our peers. I mean, we read and we say, "Oh, what an amazing way to express that."
Absolutely.
But that's not technical. That's the humanity.
Right.
And there's clearly an MT Anderson way of telling a story that doesn't come from your chops. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And
Right.
and
Yeah.
AI is never going to get there. I,
Well, I mean, AI, the complicated thing is that AI could well get there. I mean, they have ways. Right now, the emphasis in AI is on essentially coming up with the most kind of common, banal answer. That's the way that it works right now because it is literally a language sorting model, right? But they have ways already to, as they would put it, kind of statistically roughen that. That is to say, adding in, instead of going for the most common or acceptable next term, trying to kind of like occasionally statistically strike out into unusual territory. So for example, if you roughen an AI model a lot, you will get something that reads like Dadaist poetry. Whereas if you don't roughen it at all, you're going to get something that sounds like a reasonably intelligent sophomore college essay. So I do think that one of the things is that they are going to actually be able to statistically reproduce creativity in some ways. Whether like what that looks like, I don't know. And I mean, you do hope that as an author, you also have a strategy, an internal, unspoken strategy for why you're doing things a particular way in that particular project. And it's going to be longer before AI can actually strategize in that way, though it already appears to strategize, if you see what I mean.
right.
So
Right.
anyway, I don't feel like it's like AI. I feel like it's an extremely bleak invention that no one really has asked for, and despite that fact, our civilization is going to be fundamentally changed by it.
Yeah.
I'm really not happy about that. I feel like it, along with some of the other challenges we face right now, it feels very overwhelming.
Yeah, I would encourage our listeners to uh, go into your children's room and take off their shelves landscape with invisible hand and feed, because they really do uh, depict what society can be like when systems just fully control what we want to do.
Yeah, thank you
Yeah,
for
no,
the
no, it's true.
recommendation. Yeah.
I remember when drum machines first came along,
Hmm.
and I thought to myself, I can always tell when there's a drum machine. I
Right.
can always tell. And then I met a French guy who was actually electronic artist, who his tracks really swung,
Oh,
and he said, "Yeah, you can program swing." And I was talking to Wint Marcellus about it, and
yeah,
he said, "Oh, we notate swing, Jim. It's not natural. We
right.
we can teach anybody to swing
Yeah,
who can read music." And I guess that's my fear with AI, that eventually,
yep.
anyway, and
No, I totally agree, and I think we're kind of on the edge of that now, you know, and there are all the questions about what is it going to be like when when we reach the singularity, and also, of course, then the question of how does that redefine what it means to have a purpose for humans. I mean, we have always assumed, because we are the dominant species on the planet, that the purpose of the rest of the planet is in fact to serve our needs. um, and the complexity within our society, we've decided the purpose of certain people is to serve the needs of other people, blah blah blah. What happens when there's a kind of an ontological shift and suddenly we have to say, well, wait a second, we've always based this on capability to control and intelligence, but we're not at the apex of that triangle anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah, anyway, but this is all speculative. But yes, I think this is going to be a real this is going to be a kind of evolutionary level change in what it means to be human.
I want to go on to a cheerier matter, if you
Please.
don't mind. I love the idea that you're introducing young readers to classical music.
Mm.
Do you have a background in music?
No, just as a listener, like I really love the only, as I joke, the only instrument I know how to play is the stereo. But you know, I have been like, I feel like music changed my life. I feel like the the way that music has broadened so much, classical music even has broadened so much since I was a kid, is wonderful. I mean, we no longer have to listen to the kind of old war horses. We now have kind of the classical musics of different cultures available
Yes.
to us, you know, absolutely easily through the streaming model. You can listen to, you know, gamelan music and try to understand, and you know, like some of the oldest human music that was written down in a way that can be played now is the for the qin, the you know, the Chinese sort of classical tradition. And you know, to hear these things is to connect with 2000 years of human emotion and history. And I just think that that's incredibly powerful to be able to
Yeah.
say, you know, oh my God, I'm listening to something that moved someone in the year 1500 or in the year 300, you know?
Right. Can you talk a bit about Symphony for the City of the Dead? Um,
Sure.
I
Yeah.
just what a wonderful way to tell a story.
Well, that was another instance where I was kind of surprised into doing more more work than I thought I would. So, you know, the idea is I'd heard this story that during the siege of Leningrad during World War II, it's the longest siege in recorded human history. The Germans surround the city of Leningrad with millions of people trapped inside, and and decide that they're not going to attack the city. They're just going to starve the city out over like a terrible, terrible period of, you know, they're imagining it's only going to last for 5 or 6 months. It actually lasted for much, much longer. Anyway, and trapped inside that city was the composer Dmitri Shostakovich, who had already been stepped on by the Stalin regime and was living in terror. And now he's surrounded by these Germans. He's serving as a fireman, a rooftop fireman, putting out incendiary bombs. And he starts during that period, during that siege, to write a piece that depicts the approach of the Germans, supposedly, and the feelings of watching them gather around the city. This what became his Seventh Symphony, the Leningrad Symphony. So, and then I'd heard that once again, kind of this is kind of like the St. Nicholas thing, you know, just mentioned in some program note or something. Sometime I went to hear this piece. They mentioned that it was put onto microfilm, smuggled it through the Middle East, flown to the US, and then it was performed here on the radio to try to drum up American voters' support for the Soviets during the war. Um, and I was totally fascinated by that mention. And so immediately I started to look for academic articles because I was like, what the hell? Like the idea of a symphony being on microfilm as opposed to some kind of like, you know, the Enigma code or you know, a nuclear submarine or whatever plan you like, whatever sort of spy fiction you imagine. That just was fascinating to me. And the idea of like, wow, they really thought that it could make a difference. And in some ways it did make a difference politically to how we then supplied them with food and other like food, material, all sorts of stuff. So I discovered there was no article where anyone had ever looked into this.
Ah,
There was no discuss there, no one had ever substantiated this or whatever. So I started to do that research and eventually published academic articles about this, as well as publishing a book for teens that kind of like covers it at a much less granular level. So I managed to kind of like trace the in logistical documents, trace the movement of the microfilm across the ocean, which was totally fascinating because in fact, it was totally fucked up. Like the whole route was screwed up, and they lost the microfilm at one point. Everyone was sweating bullets. Like it was a much more complicated story than people had understood. But anyway, so I wrote this book for teens, but ended up having to do kind of like adult academic level research to tell the story that I wanted to tell. And that was like it took me 5 years to write that book, but it was also kind of like pure, I don't know, there was a pure pleasure in the fact of like taking all of these disparate pieces and forming them mosaic like into a whole. That's what's so wonderful about doing nonfiction. And also I feel like in nonfiction projects like that, I mean, it changed my understanding of human nature to look that deeply into the Soviet system in that era. I mean,
Ah,
the horrors, not just of the war, but frankly, of life under Stalinism. It changed my understanding of human capacity. It changed my understanding of modern geopolitics. I mean, Vladimir Putin's father was in the siege of Leningrad, and Putin's understanding of why he needs buffer states is fundamentally oriented around some of the terror that came of the German invasion of Russia, which happened incredibly swiftly and destructively.
yeah. I find one thing I love about the book is I'm not quite sure you're going to get a lot of people to read a biography of that artist.
Mhm.
Uh, so that you've packaged it in a thrilling war adventure. Um,
Right. Though
it,
it's all true. I mean, I do want to
yeah,
say it
that's
is a
right. Yeah,
nonfiction
yeah,
book. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And it ultimately demonstrates how art perseveres.
Yeah.
Uh,
Absolutely. Yeah.
and this concept of I'm going to be raiding more YA shelves in bookstores, I think,
Mm.
because I keep coming across these stories that are told in a manner that is digestible
Hmm.
by a younger audience, but in fact, they're wonderful appetizers for grown-ups.
Well, and frankly, like, I don't know exactly what age you are, but at a certain age, my age, like the week after you read a 500-page book on a particular figure, you really can only remember what was written on the flap anyway. So it's not like, like if it's a 200-page biography, you're going to really get as much out of it. You know what I mean?
Right,
Just choose the right stuff to put in.
right,
you know.
right. That's great. So, I want to just reference Nicked again, which was published in 2024. July of 2024, I should say. Is it too soon to ask you what's going to be next? I mean, you referenced something for young readers about St. Nicholas, but are you working on any novels now?
I'm trying to decide right now. I mean, my work on that book for young readers, the nonfiction version of the story, which is probably just going to be called like the Santa Claus heist, I think is probably the title we'll go with. Um, Beyond that, I'm literally just going to have a conversation with my editor next week and say like, should I, like, I have ideas for a sequel. I have lots of ideas for a sequel. Should I do a sequel, or should I try something entirely new? I'm used to branching out and doing very different things one after the other. That's my natural habitat or whatever, is saying like, yeah, okay, time to do, like, let's try a graphic novel. I haven't done a graphic novel. And then, let's try a big nonfiction book. Let's try, so but I'm trying to also think about like, oh, should I actually do a follow-up book because Nick did well? I mean, should I, and because those characters still kind of like entertain me, wouldn't it be fun to actually just stick with something instead of this kind of like leap into a different age, genre, and everything else that I tend to do after each book?
Yeah, yeah. MT, thanks so much for joining me on Writers at Work. Best wishes for continued success, and may Saint Nicholas grant you all your wishes this Christmas.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me.
You take care. Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersaTworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.